At this point, there's tens of kind of large language models. And yeah, there's a number of different ways we can kind of categorize your thinking about them. One of them is kind of the simplest: which ones are proprietary, which ones are open source. And they're really here, there's a spectrum when we talk about access to these. So there's some, like, for example, OpenAI, where you don't have access to the model. You don't know, what data it was trained on. You don't know the model architecture, right? You just send your data to them. They send back the predictions. And so I think that's one model there. And then all the way at the other extreme, today, for example, Databricks released the latest version of its DALL-E model, which was an open source model that was then instruction tuned on a data set that Databricks created themselves, that they're making available kind of open source for commercial use itself there. Now, so there's a whole spectrum there, but there's other spectrums here too, because the models, for example, vary in size, where you have, for example, something like Bloom that was developed by Hugging Face, which is one of the largest open source models at something like 170 billion parameters, to some of these much smaller models that are coming out, the Llama models and others that are maybe a billion parameters. And that size has implications in terms of how much reasoning ability, how much stuff is inside there. But inference, right? Like, is this something that your teenager's going to run on their own GPU, or is this something that's going to take a multi-GPU cluster to be able to effectively use? Right? There's other dimensions, like what data the models were trained on. So, for example, with the open source models, we know what data they were trained on. One piece of this, for example, that's come up is knowing how much code a model was trained on. Because one of the things that's often asked for is, hey, can we build a text to code type model where, I want to do some type of autocomplete and some type of code generation type project? Well, if I start with a large language model that already understands code, it's a lot easier to fine tune it and make that capability. So, like, understanding the underlying characteristics of that data. And right, Daniel, right? It's like a alphabet soup of different names, and like literally every week they're popping up, and there's so many of these different characteristics because they also differ, for example, on the model itself and what the licensing is, and the model weights, the data set that it was trained, the training code that it was done. Right? We see this with kind of how Meta released the Llama model, where they told everybody about it, but then they released the weights, but then they gated the weights, so only academic people were getting to them. But then, right, the weights were essentially leaked, and now they're all over the internet. So now everybody's using them. So it becomes very confusing, kind of in this big, thick mix of how to sort this out.